exclusively on Secular Media Network. This is the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Hello and welcome to the Gaytheist Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. I am your host, Callie Wright, and today's episode is called Let's Do Compassion Better. This episode was inspired by a talk that I gave at a Unitarian Universalist church. So a couple of weeks ago, on November 1st, I gave a talk at Harmony Unitarian Universalist Church here in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's a UU church that someone I'm active with in the LGBT community here goes to. And they have kind of a cool format. They basically don't have a regular minister or clergy person or pastor or whatever UU folks use to title the people who lead those services. And so they have a guest speaker every week. And the guest speaker picks a discussion topic and talks about it, and I was given no direction, no limits or anything like that, and just told, whatever talk you want to do would be great. And they also asked for me to pen 5 to 7 discussion questions for after the service, because after the talk, the congregation actually breaks up into 4 different groups of people where they talk about these discussion questions that the speaker asks. So I kind of stole the format for today's show from that service. I have to say I was a little weirded out by the whole church but not church thing. And I am 100% in favor of people finding community where it fits for them. And if secular UU church is that for you, if Sunday assembly is that for you, like I'm 100% behind that. But the rituals of the let's say the affirmation together and let's sing songs together and let's do rituals together and that kind of thing. It weirded me out a little bit. I'm not 100% sure that it's for me. And that's not to speak ill of the folks who ran the place or who were there. I had a fantastic experience. People were very receptive to what I had to say. And we had great discussions afterwards. And, people talked about it being a service that they would, remember and talk about for a while. So I definitely appreciated being invited. The experience was just a little weird, being in church that's not, about God and Jesus and all of that. So when they asked me to speak, I thought to myself, gosh, what could I talk about? Cause, I do the, Gaytheism 101 talk, aimed at the atheist community, the Gaytheism 101 talk aimed at the LGBT community. Did I want to do sort of a primer on trans identity or, because as far as I know, they'd never had a trans person speak there before. But I thought I'd take another tact and I decided to talk about compassion. Compassion's something that's super important to me, and it's something that I recognize that I fail at sometimes despite my best efforts, and I think we all do. And so I decided to make the talk, the subject of my talk, not only why do people fail to show compassion, but why do people whose parallels are in some ways, or whose struggles are in some way parallel to our own, show a lack of compassion. And this was inspired by some arguments that I have within my own community about inclusion surrounding non-binary identified folks or trans people of color and things like that, and how sometimes I get pushback when I'm arguing for more inclusion and better acceptance of those people who are sort of marginalized identities inside of an already marginalized identity. And so I thought I'd kind of explore that concept and where those attitudes come from and tell a couple stories relative to that and kind of discuss what I think my solution for that might be. So I'm going to play the talk that I gave there, and then I'm going to follow it up with a discussion that I had with my friends Ari and Jamie about, basically I posed the discussion questions that I posed to the congregation. I posed to Ari and Jamie, and I came up with my own answers to those questions. And so we're going to have a frank discussion about ways that we've sometimes failed to live up to our own standards of compassion and how we can reflect on how we can do better. We spend a lot of time on the show speaking outwardly about how you, the listener, or you, the community, or you as people can be better allies. But I think it's an important exercise for me and for people like me who definitely speak about allyship a lot to turn that lens in on ourselves and examine how we do at living up to our own standards and following our own advice. And I think anyone who does that honestly will find that they have work to do, and that's okay. We're all doing the best we can, hopefully, and trying to get better. So here's the talk that I gave on November 1st at Harmony UU Church.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Callie Wright. I am a transgender woman. I'm bisexual, and I'm an atheist. And I don't tell you these things because I think it's important for me to lead off introductions by labeling myself immediately as this or that. Labels can be problematic for many reasons, not the least of which is that learning certain things about a person before we know them as a person, it becomes easy to make assumptions about their lives and their personalities, their experiences, and their general standing in life. And I think this is something that we're probably all guilty of to some extent. Even the most liberal, accepting, open-minded people, I would bet we can catch ourselves voicing certain assumptions to ourselves about people who are different than we are, based on someone's race or gender, their outward presentation, the accent that they speak with, the vocabulary that they use, or any number of things that present outwardly but may not necessarily have a real bearing on who they are as a person. So I opened my talk today by labeling myself as an act of trust in that that's the beginning of our conversation and not the end of it. And mainly to provide context for the things that I'm going to talk about today. So, show of hands here, who's struggled with something super hard in life? Right? At the risk of being presumptuous, I would guess that if you didn't raise your hand, you're probably lying. Even the most privileged and well-off among us have struggles, and sometimes really, really monumental ones. And we see media headlines that bear this out, where we see people who live what's generally defined by society as being the ideal life of fame and fortune and material wealth. And these people still struggle with mental illness, and tragically sometimes we even see that they commit suicide. So given that we know that everyone struggles with things in life, what is the explanation for the sometimes galling lack of empathy we see exhibited by some people towards others? And what explains the even more unsettling lack of empathy by some people who have struggles parallel to others? And that's what I want to explore. So I think many or most of us are probably pretty well practiced at asking for, begging for, maybe even demanding that others be compassionate and understanding for the things that we struggle with. We've asked for that extra 5 minutes of sleep because we were working really late, or we snap at somebody we love because we're really angry and stressed out and we can't handle it, and we ask for and expect forgiveness. We ask that society leave us alone to love the person that we love, regardless of whether or not that person is the same gender we are. We ask society to accept the fact that the M or the F on our birth certificates isn't the final say in the matter. But honestly, really, truly honestly, how often are we willing to extend that same empathy, compassion and understanding to people whose struggles are foreign to our own. And how often can we look at someone whose struggles may even be somewhat parallel to our own and say, yes, I'm with you, I care about you, and you matter. I want to talk for a second about someone named Tyra Hunter. Tyra was 24 years old. She was a super popular hairdresser in Washington, D.C. Tyra was also a transgender woman who began her transition at age 14. And on her way to work one day, she was involved in a horrible car accident. And her and the driver were pulled from the car by bystanders who were looking on and were laying on the ground when the EMTs and the firefighters showed up. And a male EMT named Adrian Williams immediately got to treating Tyra, and in the process of doing so, cut open her pants leg to give treatment. And upon realizing that Tyra had a penis, the firefighter stopped treating her. She was semi-conscious, complaining of pain and gasping for breath, and the EMT was quoted by one eyewitness as saying, "This bitch ain't no girl, he's got a dick." He then joined with other first responders in making jokes about Tyra instead of treating her until an EMS supervisor showed up and continued treatment. And her experience at the hospital was no better. A doctor straight up refused to treat her, and she died early the next morning. Later on, experts would testify that had Tyra received competent medical care, she would have had approaching a 90% chance of surviving her injuries. None of the EMTs involved were ever disciplined, and Adrian Williams was actually promoted not too long after. And it would be really easy, I think, to simply condemn the people involved in this as evil, hateful, vile, bigoted, disgusting human beings. And indeed, the thing they did that day was evil, hateful, vile, bigoted, and disgusting. But I wonder, there's not much available information that I could find about Adrian Williams or the doctor that refused to treat Tyra. But if you talk to either of their friends, their families, I wonder what they would say. Was Adrian Williams a devoted family man? Was he the kind of firefighter brother that everyone knew they could count on to have their backs? Was the doctor some kind of massive innovator who developed new surgical techniques that saved a whole bunch of lives? Did they have kids that looked up to them like they were gods? Did their mothers think that they were kind and sweet boys with so much to offer the world? And this is all speculation, of course, but I think you might see where I'm going with this. It's really easy to caricature people who do awful things like this. But I think the picture is far more complicated than people usually realize, and we do ourselves a disservice when we build those caricatures. Is it really so impossible that one of us might be the Adrian Williams to someone's Tyra Hunter? Now, I think it's probably likely to say that most people here would never knowingly let a person die, but I think there are subtle and less egregious ways in which oftentimes we are all Adrian Williams. And there's no doubt in my mind that Adrian Williams had things in life that he struggled with. Some things that were devastating even. I mean, was he a person of color who experienced racism? Was he a person with mental illness who experienced the stigma surrounding that? Did he choose a different path in his life than his parents wanted him to, which usually leads to this crazy identity struggle of its own? There's no way to know for sure. But there's no doubt that Adrian Williams dealt with some level of adversity in his life, because that's an inescapable part of the human condition. But whatever his struggles were, whatever his life experience was, it apparently didn't afford him the compassion needed to see Tyra Hunter as a person whose life was worth saving. And she died because of it. Someone I'm acquainted with, a person in the local trans community, upon hearing about a really tough living situation that I was in, without hesitation offered me a room to stay in her house if I needed it. And this is a total unqualified act of kindness, despite the fact that I didn't really need to take her up on her offer. But then in a different context, this person, when being asked how in a certain context we might better include trans people who identify as non-binary, which means that they don't identify either as male or female, her response was to laugh with derision at the very idea. And here's a person who knows what it's like to struggle with her gender identity, looking down on the way that someone else identifies their gender. Her struggle in many ways is parallel to the struggle of someone who identifies not as male or female. But for some reason, that fact didn't let her feel, or at least express, the sort of empathy and compassion and understanding and kindness that she asks of others for herself. Now, I think that maybe, at least on an intellectual level, we may be able to understand the Adrienne Williams of the world. The further away someone's experience is from our own, the easier it is to see that person as the other and to treat them as such. And in the culture that we live in that so strongly discourages stepping outside of any gender boundaries, I think we can at least intellectually see where these attitudes can come from. And this is interesting to me, but what's more interesting to me is the seeming lack of empathy and compassion for people whose struggles are nearly parallel to our own. Basically, the only experience that's universal to trans people is that we just plain don't feel like we fit into the tidy little M or F boxes marked on our birth certificates. Now, it would stand to reason, I would think, that if there's a population who doesn't feel like they fit into those tidy little M or F boxes, that there would be a myriad of ways to not fit into those boxes. And given the amazing biological and cultural diversity that humanity has to offer, it would be silly to think that there's a single way to not fit in those boxes. Yet, after becoming involved in the trans community, one of the first concepts I learned is what we colloquially refer to as T3ing someone. And the term T3 refers to the term transier than thou. And it's as funny to you as it is to me because it's ridiculous. But we find in certain places in the community that these hierarchies exist. So who's been on hormones the longest? Who's had the surgery? Who passes as their gender the best? And for falling in the wrong place in these hierarchies, even trans people are punished by their own community the same way that our community is punished by broader society. And the problem, and what's really scary and what's really hard to admit, is that there's lots of evidence to suggest that these attitudes are part of our evolutionary inheritance. Humanity evolved as a tribal species. We arrange ourselves into in-groups and out-groups. So, in my humble opinion, the solution to this problem is to change who we view as in-groups and who we view as out-groups. If you look at the polling and the monumental paradigm shift in the U.S.'s support for same-sex marriage, and how many people changed their mind just in the last 10 years on the issue, when you ask why their opinions changed, the answer overwhelmingly is that they found out that someone they love was gay, or that they got to know someone that was gay. And it seems simultaneously self-evident and embarrassingly self-centered that we need a personal connection to an issue to care about it passionately. Because if we were all perfectly compassionate people, we wouldn't need to know someone who's gay to care about gay rights, right? If we truly valued all lives equally, we'd be up in arms over the fact that 5 children die every minute in Africa, 2/3 of them from preventable causes. But what was the story in Africa that got the attention of the world and the U.S. this last year? Anybody? Cecil the Lion. I heard somebody starting to say it. So how do we do this? How do we redefine what we see as being our in-group versus what we see as being our out-group? And the science is pretty clear as far as I know, and the answer is simply to get to know us. I'm not calling anyone out here, but think about your friend group and think about what, if any, diversity exists among your group of friends and your social circles. And this doesn't mean to go out and find your token black friend or your token trans friend. This means to make an effort to be involved in these various and diverse communities for their benefit and for your own. Get comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable. Being made aware of these realities can be really disconcerting. Just keep in mind when you're doing this how disconcerting it can be for those of us who live the consequences of those realities every day. Be willing to listen and honestly listen to the lived experiences of trans people, of gay people of color and women and people with disabilities and other marginalized groups. Once you do these things, if you weren't able to before, you won't be able to stop yourself from feeling the kind of empathy and compassion I talked about earlier. Once you know us, you're scientifically more likely to care about us. So get to know us, and just as important, teach your friends and loved ones about us. Be willing to speak up on our behalf if one of us isn't around. And if you didn't have a trans friend before, you've got one now. Pleasure to meet you. Thank you.
So when you put Callie in church, that's the talk you get. I hope it meant something to you. I hope you got a little something out of it. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back on the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Hello, I'm Alan Cumming. Live Out Loud is calling on the LGBT community to help improve life for gay teens. Take what you know and gay it forward through the Homecoming Project, a chance to return to your old high school and share your story with LGBTQ youth. Your life experiences and wisdom can prove invaluable to teens who may be struggling with their own identities and paths in life. One day can make a lasting difference. Gay it forward with the Homecoming Project. Find us at liveoutloud.info to learn how you can get involved today.
Before we jump back into the show, it's time to thank our patrons. Thank you so much for believing in us enough to contribute to us financially and for being a part of this movement. Patrons of the Gaytheist Manifesto have access to all sorts of cool stuff, like a big shout out on the show, premium content, including an audio journal I've decided to keep documenting the more personal stuff I don't dive into on the show, and an exclusive patrons only hangout once a month. If you're so inclined, head over to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto to become a part of this movement and support the show. Thank you. Welcome back to the Gaytheist Manifesto. For this segment, we're gonna have a super frank discussion about ways that we can be better. We spend a lot of time on the show. Well, I spend a lot of time on the show preaching to other people about how they can be better. And I figured, why not get a group of some cool people, some friends of mine together, so we can talk about the ways that we can actually be better, and things that we're maybe deficient in that we can do better. So I would like to introduce friend, patron, listener, Ari. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Callie. It's really awesome to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
And founder and president of Voice for the Innocent, Jamie Cybers. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
All right. So the first discussion question that I came up with here, let's talk about, Ari or Jamie, you can take this one first. Let's talk about a time when you failed to show compassion to someone in a certain situation.
I don't mind starting off. I think about this story actually quite a bit because I don't know, it just says a lot. And it wasn't that I failed to show compassion over any kind of difference that I had with this person. But I don't know, this probably happened like 10 years ago, and I was having whatever bad day I was having for whatever reason, and I don't remember the details of it now, but I was feeling quite grumpy, and I went to a Kroger, which is a grocery store in Cincinnati, and they have those little like gas station, separate gas station buildings or whatever. Excuse me, and I walked up there, and there was a little bit of a line, and, the lady inside, there's one lady inside this tiny building, and she's trying to give the people what they need, the gas on whatever pump and whatever cigarettes they wanted or whatever. They don't have really anything else in there. And she's like fumbling around. She's talking on the phone, and, she's like, this guy in front of me asked for whatever cigarettes he wanted, and she's too busy talking on the phone. She grabs the wrong cigarettes and hands them to him. And he's like, no, that's not what I said. Like, I said this, whatever. And she gave him the right ones. And then the next person went up and said, like, I want 15 on this pump. And then she forgot to give him his change. Like, she was all the way distracted by this phone call that she had. And I just like already having a bad day, and I'm already frustrated. And she then got to me, and I asked for whatever pack of cigarettes I wanted, and she gave me the wrong ones, and I just snapped, and I used a whole lot of very colorful language at her and said, like, if you would get off the effing phone and do your effing job, maybe this line would go quicker and not everyone would be waiting on you. Like, you need to just get better. I'll go somewhere else, you know. And I'd like to also remind at this point in the story, this was at least 10 years ago. So, and so I guess the little bit of redemption that I had is about 10 minutes down the road, I really started to feel bad. Like, you know, this lady didn't do anything to me. And so I like called the local Kroger and I asked to be connected to the little gas station attendant. And I said, like, she answered and I said, like, hi, I just cussed you out in your line and I'm having a really bad day and I'm so sorry about that. I have no excuse for it. I shouldn't have done that, but I just wanted you to know how sorry I am. And she said, I'm really, you know, and she thanked me for calling. And she said, like, I was on the phone with my son's school. There was some sort of issue with his health. And like that simple lesson, like, you know, she didn't walk away feeling like some jerk cussed her out. I think that she genuinely appreciated the apology, but I like till this day, I still think about like, we never know someone else's situation, you know? And so like this lady was older than me. She was old. She was in her 40s probably. And she obviously was a different gender and she was African American. None of these things had anything to do with why I was rude to her. But I was rude to her nonetheless. And I did not know her situation or what kind of panic she was having on the phone while frantically still trying to do her job. So, yeah, I learned a lot from that lesson.
And Ari, what about you?
I was thinking about being a part of the queer community and the mental health support community and also just the social justice, if you want to call it that, community in general. A lot of times we can get into kind of a bad habit of going into what we like to call the oppression Olympics. If somebody is, you know, talking about something in their lives that's hard for them and we feel like, oh, that's nothing compared to what I'm going through. Like, I have it much worse than you do. And I think a lot of that is because, you know, it makes you can maybe even kind of threaten you a little bit. Like, oh, why should they, you know, be complaining about this thing? Like, I went through it and I was fine. So there have been times in groups and talking with friends and stuff where I've thought in my head, like, are you really complaining about that? But, you know, it's always really helpful to step back and realize that everyone's journey is their own journey, and something that is not difficult for you might be difficult for someone else, or vice versa.
Yeah, that that actually leads pretty nicely into my story. Listeners to the show will have heard, because we're actually recording this segment separately, but listeners to the show will have heard the talk that I gave at this Unitarian Universalist church, where I was talking about a member of the trans community here who was simultaneously showed me an extremely kind gesture and then turned around and was very derisive of the very idea that a non-binary trans person or a genderqueer trans person would even exist, let alone deserve, you know, inclusion in, you know, in our community. And for that and various other reasons, I'm not super fond of this person. But obviously, that doesn't mean that they're not a person and they don't deserve basic respect. And I was in a meeting with this person on a committee, and I don't want to give too many details because I don't want to, you know, give away anyone's identities or anything like that. But suffice it to say, the topic of suicide came up. And she started going on and on about how, you know, suicide was this cowardly and selfish act, and how, you know, we shouldn't be glorifying suicide or giving any attention to people who committed suicide. And I think most of us know that those are all super problematic attitudes to have towards suicide. And so I voiced that to her in a fairly aggressive way. Because of, you know, the context of the conversation and how, you know, we were kind of always at odds about everything anyways. So we're going back and forth about this for a second. And like I said, I'm being pretty aggressive because that made me so mad. But then I realized that the reason she was so the reason why she felt so strongly about it is because her wife had committed suicide.
Oh, wow.
And, I thought to myself, that fact doesn't necessarily, change how correct or incorrect anything she said or anything I said was. But I definitely would have and should have handled the conversation differently in that context, after the fact. So, I think it kind of goes back to the idea of, you don't really know what someone's going through if they're acting, if they seem to be acting mean or, flighty or forgetful or something like that. You never know, especially if it's a stranger or someone you don't know super well. You don't always know what's going on, and it's easy to make assumptions about that. So that's my story. The next question is, when was the last time you had a conversation where you listened more than you talked? Ari, let's start with you since Jamie started the last one.
Yeah, Jamie, gosh. Well, in recent years, I've kind of become more aware of the issues of racial injustice that are going on in this country especially. And I'm a white person, and I grew up in a majority white area in the South. And so I was never really exposed to these kind of ideas, especially with things like the Black Lives Matter movement. And some of the things they were saying, obviously, I was totally on board. Everyone should be treated equally racially. But, growing up, I was kind of always taught that race shouldn't ever be an issue. And if you make it an issue, you're making an issue where there shouldn't be an issue. So I was kind of like, I'm really not sure how I feel about this. I mean, obviously, the whole police brutality and all these other things that are going on are a huge problem, but I'm not sure that I agree with the tactics that some of these protesters are going through, and some of the rhetoric online as well. I felt like they were like anti-white people. So I recently, back when I lived in Arkansas, I started going to a queer youth group that was also talked about racial issues and gender equality and that kind of thing. And there were some people in that group that were kind of saying some things along those lines that I wasn't necessarily comfortable with. So I just sat and listened to them and tried to hear what they were saying. And the explanation that I got was different than what I had thought the whole Black Lives Matter thing meant. I had thought originally that they were maybe saying like Black lives matter more than white lives, or we need to focus on Black lives only and everyone else doesn't really matter. But of course, listening to them explain it, it's not that Black lives are the only ones that matter. It's that Black lives are the ones that are, being targeted right now. They're the ones that we need to focus on, improving and treating better and treating equally. So it really changed my mind on that for sure, and especially talking to some of the people in that group who were people of color. So I learned that it's really important to listen to the people themselves who have these experiences, because how can you say that you know better than someone who has lived through something that you haven't lived through?
Yeah, I agree. And that's, my story kind of falls along those lines too. Jamie, what do you got?
So I think that if I've learned to be good at anything, it's having conversations where I listen more than I talk. And that, if I'm good at one thing in the entire world, which is likely, like, and I think it's only that way because of A Voice for the Innocent. And when we're talking about responding on an individual level with somebody who's been affected by sexual violence, when we're training people, volunteers or people who are responding to stories on the website, we go by a three-word mantra almost, which is listen, believe, and validate. And so like listen is literally the number one step. And like I just gave a presentation at a couple different colleges about how to respond to people who have been affected by sexual violence, and spent a good amount of time on listening and about how, at these moments, it's not our time to talk and fill up with our own anecdotes. It's our time to listen to someone else's perspectives, where I falter is literally with my own partner, like with my wife. If we get into some sort of discussion where she's trying to tell me something she's aggravated with about me or about something I've done around the house, with her, and I don't know why it is. Like, she's obviously no different. I don't know if it's because I'm at home, and so I feel like this comfort level is different, but I am not as good as I should be with her, I think. I have a tendency when she's saying, hey, you do this and it makes me feel like this, I have a tendency to then say, give me an example, and she thinks, and I'm not doing it to be cruel. I'm doing it because I'm really trying to, grasp what she's saying. But her point of view is like, not never, but in these moments, like, you're not validating what I am feeling. And like, I'm not trying to search for an example for you. I'm trying to just tell you how I feel. So like, I still obviously have very much work to do on that. And I think even with you, Callie, like, obviously we have disagreements on quite a few topics, but
That we do.
Drums.
Oh, so much drama.
we wouldn't have so many disagreements if Callie were right about more. You know what I mean?
Right.
No, but I think that's so important. Like, we obviously have such different life experiences. I mean, doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that I care about you any less, but it's important, I think, for us to have that open communication because, like, how would I know how to support you in your life, and how would I know how to better understand your situation if I'm not listening? So I guess I'm contradicting myself here in that I cannot come up with a specific example for you. But
well, no, I think that's good commentary though, because I think that's the point of the question. I think is to sort of non-aggressively call someone out if they like, man, I really can't think of a time where I've ever done that.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to as opposed to actually trying to think of a specific example. I think it's a broader commentary on like, is that a thing that you can even do? Because that's something that, obviously I'm a person who does a podcast. I do speaking and all that kind of stuff. So I'm very used to throwing my opinion out in the ether. And, it's definitely a learned skill for me to not do that in certain situations where it's more appropriate for me to just stop talking and listen.
Right.
And actually going back to what you said, Ari, my story actually has to do with race issues as well. I think it was the second to last episode of the show where I had Mandisa Thomas and Alex Jules on to talk about race.
Right.
One of the reasons why I waited so long to do a show on race is I wanted to make sure that I wanted to make sure that I tried to ask the right questions and really honor and validate the answers that I was given. And if you listen to that episode, basically I ask a question and then Mandisa and Alex talk for like 10 or 15 minutes after that. And then like I'll ask a follow-up question and then they talk for 10 or 15 minutes after that. And I thought it was great.
Yeah.
I would say a couple of words and then just like sit back in my chair and just listen to them go on and on. And I think that's awesome, and that's how I learned because one of the reasons why I sort of brought up this question is because people do that kind of thing to me a lot, and people do that thing to trans people a lot. And anybody who's been through any sort of experience that makes you part of any kind of marginalized group. Present company talking, if you're the victim of sexual violence in some way, or if you're a trans person, or if you happen to be a person of color, like folks in those positions get talked down to a lot by people who don't share those experiences. And it took, I'm not super proud of this, but it took that happening to me before I recognized that I was doing it to people of color on race issues.
Yeah, I have exactly the same experience.
So that's kind of why I thought that was important. So the next question is, name a preconception or assumption you've made about someone based on things like their race or their gender or their sexuality. Jamie, what do you got?
I was going to say, do I get to start one again?
We're taking turns. We're taking turns, children.
So, it's funny because actually your commentary there leads right into this. I'm a public educator for a violence prevention strategy called Green Dot. And we go into different schools and we basically teach we teach bystander intervention, but to a very, very on a very deep level, like actual tactics, and we talk about the psychology behind why, bystander or diffusion of responsibility and all these different things, like why bystanders don't act. We talk about these things, and we really try to help students embrace this and change a culture that supports violence in their school. And my very first school that I took on alone is a school that I'm in now. And this school is 90% African American and in a very, very low income part of town. And I was legitimately having not panic attacks, but I was very panic stricken about going in. And it wasn't because I was worried or anything like that. It was more like, how am I supposed to connect with these kids? Because that's one of the big things about Green Dot is being able to connect and have a relationship with these students that you're teaching. Because we're not just in once and done. We actually are in the school all year long doing different activities and this and that. And so I'm thinking what kinds of ways am I going to go in and connect with students? Are they obviously right now, I don't personally, I think that obviously police brutality is a very bad thing. And I am behind the Black Lives Matter movement and everything, but I didn't really understand that side of things. I didn't understand, are these students going to have some sort of preconception about who I am or what my thing is? Is there animosity towards me as a white person, as a white male? And I really got really, really nervous about going into this school for all these reasons. Am I going to be able to do my job? Am I going to be authentic? I don't want to come off as someone who's just assuming that I know their position. And turns out they're just people. and I had, I'm having a great time in this school. But that was totally my own ignorance not even ignorance, because I know these things, but for some reason, when faced with this opportunity and faced with this situation where I'm going into the school, I was really, I think I just started to overthink it. It's almost as if I'd let conservative news outlets take a hold of my brain. You know what I mean? It was, and tell me that I need to be worried about all this. And actually one of the things we're doing right now is focus groups, where I just go in for a half hour once a week and I talk to one class, and I just get their perspective on school and what school is like for them, the things they like, the things they dislike, and all this. And one of the questions I ask, and it's an open discussion in this class, and one of the things I ask is, what do you like or dislike about speakers when they come in? And, I obviously had said nothing about the insecurities that I was having at this school. Why would I have done that? That's all the way unprofessional. But I'm thinking this in the very first day that I did this focus group, one of the students raised their hand and they said, we don't like it when speakers just assume they know how we live. And I was like, okay, see, there's shut up, Jamie. You know what I mean? Shut up, Jamie.
Right.
And I think, I don't know. I mean, I really, really am enjoying my time there. And the staff did this really cool thing where they had a staff retreat and they invited community partners. So I went to that, and they put us on school buses and they took us through all the communities where these students are coming from. And it's a very large school. And, part of it is a literal food desert. They can't get fresh food where they live. A lot of public transportation. A lot of people aren't, owning cars down there, and a lot of apartment complexes. And I think that was very eye-opening, because the whole point of that was to understand that, if a student's coming into class and their homework's not done, maybe understand where they're coming from a little bit. If you can't get food at night, how worried are you about homework? You know what I mean? And it was a really eye-opening experience. But for me, I think it provided that perspective. But I think it also made me oh my gosh, I did grow up in a poor house on welfare and food stamps, and I still don't know anything about. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
It almost added to this sense of separation when that separation isn't there at all. I get a sense that these kids like me. We're laughing and we're joking, and I really, really like them. And this whole time there was literally nothing to be worried about. So that's my story.
What do you got, Ari?
So I'm trans, and I spend a lot of time in queer spaces and trans spaces, and I've learned, especially recently, I am genderqueer, non-binary, which basically, if you don't know what that means, it just means that I don't consider myself as male or female. So a lot of times, everyone goes through life assuming people's genders based on the way that they look. If someone, has large breasts and a certain fat distribution and a certain voice range, that person is a female. You use she, her pronouns, all that stuff. Same thing with men, which is what, most people are raised to think. And, then you get into this whole trans world and you're like, well, if someone is, for example, wearing feminine clothes, but they have a more masculine facial structure and a deeper voice, well, then that's probably a trans woman. And I've met people who that's actually not the case. Even, just looking at that person, you would assume that, they're a trans man or a trans woman, and then you find out that they are actually non-binary in some way, or, just that their physical appearance doesn't necessarily connect to, how they see themselves in the world and how they interact with others in the world. So it's been really interesting for me. And I use they, them, their pronouns because they're gender neutral. And so a lot of times when I see somebody who, just making an assumption based off the way that they look, that they might also be non-binary, genderqueer, I sort of automatically assume that they would also use gender-neutral pronouns. But you really can't tell just by looking. You have to ask a person. There are so many different combinations of ways that people can look and ways that, people see themselves and ways they want to be seen by others in the world, and they want to interact with other people in their social circles. Even when you think you're being progressive, it's not necessarily, you're not necessarily going to get it right based on assumptions, the way people look or the way people act, your assumptions about, how trans people are or people in general are.
Yeah, and that actually, that plays into the answer for my last question, so I'm going to hold on to that. But for me, I think the most pronounced ways that I've made assumptions about people in the past, and still do sometimes, I feel like I'm better at it than I used to be, but I'm still not perfect, is surrounding religious people and making assumptions about what people think and what people believe because they have a certain religious identity, whether it's Muslim or Christian or Hindu or pagan or whatever. I tend to assume that pagans are all idiots who are obsessed with woo. Christians are all anti-gay, anti-trans bigots. Muslims are all terrorists. Those ridiculous extreme stereotypes. Obviously those are a very extreme version. I don't think that I've ever actually thought in that, black and white of a way about any particular brand of, religious belief. But I definitely used to be that angry atheist that thought Christians were all idiots and that Christians were all stupid, and if they would just think for a second, they would see how wrong they are. And I would make assumptions that no one had ever given critical thought to their belief system or their religion. Of course they would all be atheists. Exactly. Because if anyone would think for a second, they would obviously agree with me.
Exactly.
So that's something that I'm generally still kind of guilty of. And then another one that I think kind of ties along with it is making assumptions about people's life situations based on a certain opinion they're espousing. For example, I like to think that I can generally identify someone's station in life by their opinions on social justice issues, which is a silly thing to do. I can do it and be right a certain amount of a certain amount of the time, but I don't know that it's necessarily the right way to operate. If a white person is dismissive of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, it's just because you have white privilege, not because of any other thing, or, even though I think that position is objectively wrong, I tend to assume that you think this way because X without having asked that person why they think the way that they do. And I think that's kind of unhelpful to discourse. And that's something that I'm pretty guilty of and I'm trying to get better at. So, this is a more practical question. What's one thing you're not doing that you could be doing to better show empathy and compassion towards folks who are marginalized, oppressed, or otherwise hurting or in vulnerable positions? Ari, let's start with you.
I think, just going back to what we were talking about a few questions ago about, finding people who are in different situations than you and listening to what they have to say and trying to learn from it without, trying to tell them that they're wrong and their experience is wrong and you have it right. I think it's one thing that, it's a really human thing to want to surround yourself with people who agree with you and people who are similar to you. And obviously, there are benefits to that. You don't obviously want to surround yourself with people that make you angry and sad and people that are going to make you miserable to be around all the time. But at the same time, it's really easy to fall into, seeking out the same types of friends who all have, the same types of experiences. Maybe they're all in the same sort of social class, or they're all mostly one race, usually the race that you are. So one thing that I would really like to do is to, be able to seek out friendships with, more diverse people just so that I can understand a little better where they're coming from. Especially for example, on social media, you always, follow the pages that, say things that agree with you and you are friends with the people that you agree with already. And you can kind of get into a big echo chamber problem. So it's really important, I think, to break out of that, at least occasionally, if not, as often as you can, and try and seek out some other opinions and challenge yourself. And really, as an atheist, as a skeptic, it's really important for me to challenge my ideas and make sure that my ideas hold up to the facts and stand up to scrutiny. And there's no way to do that without, being challenged from someone who has a different opinion from you.
Yeah, I agree. And I think an important addendum to that is to not cross the line into tokenizing people.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That's not what I was trying to say.
No. I know that's not what you were trying to say, but that's definitely a thing that I think happens sometimes. I've literally had someone tell me like, "Oh, you're trans. I've always wanted to be friends with a trans person. I can cross that off my bucket list now." Like literally somebody told me that they could cross that off their bucket list now, like they have a trans friend. And I heard someone say that to a non-binary person once. I've always wanted to know a non-binary person. That's achievement
but then
unlocked.
Basically what you're doing is just reducing that person down to that one part of their lives.
Exactly.
Which of course it's not that their only identity, not the only thing in their lives.
Right. So the idea is to sort of, become, active in that sort of community, not to just seek out a token trans friend or a token black friend or something like that, but really try and become involved in those communities so you can kind of better understand those kinds of things. And that's a hard line to walk because, I want to know all the things about all the people and I want to think like, ooh, yeah, like I have a black friend now. Now I know black stuff. And that's
now
like...
I'm an expert on, race relations because
totally.
I have a black friend.
Yeah, not at all correct. Jamie, what about you?
So this isn't my original idea, but I can't give credit where it's due because I don't know where it came from exactly. But Pinky, my wife, came home, I think last week, and she was talking about this TED Talk that she saw. So I didn't see the TED Talk, and I did not give credit to it. But it was this idea that, you have people who, like, let's say they make a decent amount of money, and they might give a generous contribution once or twice a year to a charity of their choice, and then they feel like they've done their good for the year, and not that shouldn't be a thing. Or like, for me, I do work on, A Voice for the Innocent and, we're all here talking about this because we care about marginalized groups and we care about, those who are underserved. But the whole point of this TED Talk was like, if there is good to be done, like we're not done, and And the whole concept was do the most good. And I'm sure if you search on Google, do the most good, you can find that talk. I wish I could give credit to the right person, but like that really had me thinking, like it's had me thinking for the last week or so since I've been, found out about that idea. And, unfortunately it's not just one thing that I'm not doing. You know what I mean? It's a lot of things that I'm not doing that I could get better at. Like, sure, I'm doing all that I can in one area of my life. Like I really try to work to prevent violence and to help those who have been affected by sexual violence. But am I correcting someone every time I see someone else mistreated? Am I doing everything I can to understand other people's experiences and their perspectives? I'm not, because frankly I get tired, but that doesn't stop the amount of good that needs to be done. You know what I mean? I still love the NFL despite all their horrible domestic violence situations that they have. You know what I mean? There are a lot of things I wish I could be doing better and I need to get better at. I could be a better ally for LGBT people. I see people say things all the time that I don't just say like, hey, come on. You know what I mean? That's not right. I see the same thing about African Americans or about Muslims. Like I do see this, and I see homeless people that I don't step out to support. So I think that's the thing for me is like, it's not just one thing. Like, sure, I have areas where I can improve. I have lots of areas where I can improve. And I think I always want to be striving to do the most good. Like that guy said, like Pinky had told me, like, to better serve homeless and to better serve, my LGBT friends and to better serve whomever I need serving. Do you know what I mean? So I think the good place to start for that and the solid answer to your question is I just need to continue learning. I need to continue seeing other people's perspectives and learning life experiences that are different than mine, I think.
Yeah, I hear that. And mine kind of follows from that. I talked about in my answer to the last question, the fact that I have to sort of curb my urge to always, throw my opinion out into the ether. Even when it may not necessarily be, wanted or needed or relevant to the conversation, because I'm a person who feels like I have to have an opinion about everything and that, I'm just so smart that everyone needs to know what I have to say about certain issues. But, for example, when we're talking about racism, if people of color are talking about racism, I probably don't have a ton to add to that conversation because that's not a thing that I experience in my life. I can empathize in a certain way because I felt what it's like to be discriminated against for being trans or, for being female or for being atheist or whatever. But that's obviously not the same as systemic racism. So I can't pretend like I know exactly how they feel. So mine really comes down to knowing when it's appropriate to speak up and to stand up and make my voice heard, and when it's appropriate for me to step back and stop talking and listen and and let other folks speak, and even give whatever platform I have to other people for those things, because their voices might say it better than mine. Which is why, I like having, guests on the show that, that have those sorts of experiences. I'm very much aware that, in society, when you think of transgender woman or when you think of transgender person, the default thing that people think about is a white trans woman. And hi, that's me. So, so I definitely
quit being a stereotype.
Right. So, I definitely try my best to have other perspectives on, so I'm not just getting caught up in my own experience and forgetting about others. And, that's definitely something that I do, but I think we can always do better. And that's something that I'm definitely working on. So the last question is, tell a story about a time you stepped out of your comfort zone to learn how to be a better ally. And I think it's your turn, Jamie.
Sure. Really, the story that comes to mind is Callie when you came out,
right.
Which I would assume that would be the story that you would have guessed I would tell,
Yes.
I knew a whole zero trans people, at that point in my life.
That you knew of.
I suppose that's true.
Yeah.
I suppose that's true. But certainly none of my close friends, or certainly none of my family. So I probably, and it turns out actually, I guess I hadn't gone to my second bookstore yet, so I hadn't met Micah. But at that time, I really didn't have any close trans people in my life, and I hardly knew what that meant, let alone how to support or how to continue. Like, of course, how to continue being friends with someone. You just do it. You know what I mean? But like at that time, it felt like a whole lot like going into that school. You know what I mean? Like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And I remember having multiple conversations with you. That's like, look, I'm going to do this, but I need you to bear with me too while I figure this out. I specifically remember the first time that I saw you as Callie. I always will. Like, that was a huge, and as much as we've hung out a million times alone, before and after your transition, and I have had zero problems with it. But that one night at IHOP, and this sounds really mean, and of course I don't mean it to be mean.
No,
I didn't want to be the first one there with you. You know what I mean? Because I didn't know how that was going to be. And so I pulled into that IHOP, and then I drove down to Home Depot waiting for Eric to get there so that I could join you and Eric inside and maybe make myself a little comfortable. And then of course Eric was late, so I pulled into the parking lot and you followed me in, and I was like, okay, well, damn it, this is how this is going to be. It's crazy how 95% of the time, nothing changes. And when they do, sure, maybe you might see someone looking or staring, and then you literally just think like, oh, F that person. You know what I mean? But there was a big step outside my comfort zone. And it wasn't because I was, necessarily uncomfortable with the idea, but it was so hard to, I guess at that time, or at least I thought it was hard, to learn how to be a good ally and to, and I have to thank you for that too, because you were always very open to questions that I had and things I had, and you've always been forgiving of my ignorances. But
and I think context is important too, because I talk often about, I played in bands and we toured and all that kind of stuff, and Jamie and I were in a band together. And, Jamie and I were in a band where we often slept in the van, slept on living room floors in very close conditions, where there was not a whole lot of modesty going on. And, so I think Jamie had a more cemented perception of me as this like gigantic teddy bear of a fat bearded guy. So.
Yeah, and I think too, and this is a thing that I suppose would have been a good answer for number 3. But if you had, I think one of the things that made it so difficult, or at least so hard for me to wrap my head around, or I don't want to say accept, because it's not that I didn't accept it, but one of the things that was hardest to get used to is I would have, I suppose if a gay male had said, "Oh, I'm trans," that would have been like that in my head. That would have been like, "Oh, that makes sense." But you, as what I assumed was a straight, hairy metal dude, you know what I mean? Right. It felt very out of left field for me, and I guess so. That was a preconception that I had, but yeah, that was definitely uncomfortable, and very glad and it was only uncomfortable for a short time. I think only leading up to it. Once it happened, it was like, all right, you know what I mean? But it was only that time when I didn't know what to expect, and it was all out of left field. And the other thing that sounds silly about me saying all this, that I think is me saying, Callie, it was so difficult for me to go through your transition, which is
sad.
Which is not what I'm saying at all. You know what I mean?
But no, I know what you mean. Well, we've talked a lot on the show before about the journey is not only ours. People that we love go through a journey of their own, and that's okay. So yeah.
Well, that's it. I think that's my whole.
I like to add how red Jamie's face is.
My face isn't red. No one can see me. My face isn't red.
Yeah, that's true.
I got my Starbucks cup makeup on. That's all that is.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Like I said, you can't make assumptions about people based on their appearance.
Right.
See?
Right, especially not when you can't see them.
Yes. That makes it even harder.
Okay, Ari, what's your story?
Well, I almost have the opposite problem from Callie, from what Callie was talking about last time about the last question, about how she kind of really likes to put her opinion out there and, make her opinion known and tell other people that they're wrong. And I have all the anxiety disorders, so it's definitely, I have more of a problem with speaking up when I should, because, of course, I feel afraid of social judgment, and what if I can't defend myself, and what if I don't change this person's mind? Everyone is counting on me to change this person's mind because they have these harmful attitudes. So I've been trying, especially online, because people are jerks online a lot of times, say things that they wouldn't say, in front of people in quote unquote real life. I've been trying more to, speak up when I see somebody saying something that is not only hurtful or harmful or wrong, but, something that is, really contributing to, oppression of people, to use that word in this context. Again, it's harder, it face to face because, again, what I was talking about before, we tend to, associate ourselves with people who already agree with us. So I don't think I've had too many instances in, face to face of people saying like these outrageously transphobic, racist, homophobic, all these different things out loud. And I really hope that I would be able to say something. But I'm also a very small person who is afraid of getting beaten up. So there's that. And, what was I saying? Yeah, but, just saying things online. And I know it kind of sounds like, oh, you're just doing it online, you're not doing it in real life. But I think, a lot of really important discussion does happen online because, people will say things online that they won't necessarily say in person, and you'll get their real, true, honest opinion a lot of times because since they're not, in front of a person or hearing their voice, they don't feel like they have to censor themselves as much. So, there can be some really hateful and vitriolic things online. And it's also a good forum for other people to take part in your conversation as well. Especially on comment threads, everyone can see what, people are saying. So you have the opportunity, I think, to reach a lot more people. And of course, it always feels good when people like your comment. So there's that.
Right. Validation.
Yes.
Well, and I think it's important to not downplay the importance that online discussions can have. I mean, sometimes they feel useless because sometimes you feel like you're just beating your head up against the wall. But I can't tell you how many times I've gotten private messages from people after a discussion like that where, it may not be a person that I was arguing with, but it was a person who was watching the argument. And, they would say something like, wow, I was kind of on the fence about that whole thing until I saw the things that you said, and that made sense to me. So I'm very, very hesitant to dismiss those kinds of things as unimportant. I can think of 2 or 3 things off the top of my head, like major shifts in opinion that I've had from having discussions with people online. Abortion is one that comes to mind.
Oh, yeah.
I used to be a quasi anti-choice atheist. But it was a big online debate discussion that ended with somebody linking me to a debate that Matt Dillahunty did. That totally changed my mind on the whole thing. So I'm definitely hesitant to completely dismiss those things. I mean, obviously sometimes they are useless, but you can probably find a million people who will say that they changed their mind because of something they read in one of those discussions. So don't sell yourself
short. What I was talking
short.
about before with the trying to listen to people on racial issues, most of that did happen online. So it's been really important for me, and that in that regard, because again, you can connect with people that you wouldn't necessarily connect with in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I saw someone today say they retracted their statement, and this person literally never retracts their statements.
Wow.
I put that in a win column, but I never would have expected that to happen. But it was because I think I kind of stuck up for something. So I second Callie with that.
Yeah.
They can be important.
So my story comes back to, Ari, what you were talking about, preconceptions about, based on people's, gender expression or, the way that they present. And, as, a binary identified person who, I'm going to be honest, I didn't really realize that genderqueer was a thing until I started getting involved in the trans community. I'd never even really heard that term. Right. And I never really heard that term before. And so the first time I went to a meeting where they opened the meeting by, saying your names and your name and your pronouns, I'm going to be honest, it kind of weirded me out. Because as a binary identified person, when someone assumes my pronouns and assumes correctly, that's a very validating experience for me.
Yes.
But what I wasn't thinking about is all of the people who, if you take societal gender stereotypes into account, generally speaking, a non-binary person is never going to be gendered correctly based on assumption, because no one is going to look at someone and assume that they're non-binary and prefer they, them, their pronouns, because everyone is programmed to assume male, female, or I'm not sure whether they're male or female. Exactly. So it definitely took me learning about that to understand why that kind of thing was important, because, I kind of bristled at it a little bit, because I'm like I'm wearing a dress and makeup and my hair's up in a ponytail and, I have a purse. Like, what the hell pronouns do you think I prefer? You know what I mean? And it took some learning for me to understand why that was a problematic attitude to have. So that's kind of my story of stepping out and learning that, like, hey, you know what? It's not actually all about me and my experience.
I think that's the message of this whole segment. Not all about you.
Right. Which is, like, it's strange that that's such a difficult message to get, to get through to people sometimes. Well, that's going to do it for this segment here, friends. Ari, do you have anything that you want to plug before we go?
Well, not really. This is the first time I've been on a podcast or anything similar. I guess if people want to friend me on Facebook, my name is Ari Coleman. Ari is the first name. And just send me a message that you heard me on the Gay Theist Manifesto, so I know you're not like a Nigerian prince or trying to hack into my account to sell me Ray-Bans or something like that. That's about it.
Very cool. Jamie, quick plug for AVFTI?
Yeah, I don't want to plug my podcast because it's a waste of time. But
no, you should definitely plug your podcast because it's great.
Okay, very quickly, a friend of mine and I do a very silly podcast for movie lovers. If you like movies, you might like it. It's called Same Name Movie Club, and it's a waste of time. But a voice for the innocent is what I really...
Listen, hang on. It's not a waste of time. They spend like 30 to 40 minutes explaining why all of the movies ever are exactly the same. And it's great. And if you think it sounds good, that's because I mix it. So just throwing that out there.
Well, I'm glad you enjoy it. We have one fan, and that's Callie, who mixes it for us. No, but A Voice for the Innocent is a nonprofit community of support for people affected by rape and sex abuse. And if there's anyone who needs to tell a story, or and it can be someone who's indirectly affected too. We have people come on and say, like, my son is dealing with this, or my brother, or my sister, like whomever it might be. So anonymous website where you can share a story and gain support from fellow community members. So you can do that at avfti.org, and we're also on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all that good stuff. So.
Very cool. Well, Ari and Jamie, thank you both for joining me on the show here. I think this was a great discussion. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gay Theist Manifesto on Secular Media Network. I want to say a big thank you again to my guests, Jamie and Ari, for a great discussion. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/thegaytheistmanifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCallie, and you can find the show on Twitter at TheGaytheists. Real quick before I close the show out, I did want to remind everyone that next week on Thursday is going to be our Transgender Day of Remembrance episode. It's a super important day for the transgender community, and I've got a pretty heavy but pretty sobering and honest and epic episode of the show planned, so please don't miss that. And then the week after that, the evening of Thanksgiving, I want to remind everyone that I will be doing a 2-hour live show the evening of Thanksgiving from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm going to have 4 different guests. I'm going to have JT Eberhard, David Smalley, Ryan Bell, and Hina Databoy join me for a half hour each. We're going to be having a discussion about family. We're going to share stories. We're going to tell jokes and laugh and maybe even cry a little bit. I don't know. But the general idea is that if you are a person who doesn't have a place to go on Thanksgiving because you're rejected by your family, your friends, for being atheist or LGBT, or for any other reason, you just don't have a place to go, come hang out with us. Just go to Spreaker.com and search for the Gaytheist Manifesto that evening, and you'll find the live show. You can join us in the chat room. You can shoot us tweets. And I should have a phone number that we can call in that night to share stories. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.